Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Being middle class in America used to mean something socially transformative, something even revolutionary. That's what Christine Rosen writes in her article called The Elite War on the American Middle Class and How to End It. And today I'm really delighted to be talking about this article with Christine. Christine is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on American history, society and culture, technology and culture, and feminism. She's also a columnist for Commentary magazine. Welcome to Qualified Opinion, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we start, can you tell us a little bit about you, how you got to the jobs you have, and how you picked that particular research agenda?
Sure. I have a kind of meandering career path, and that I started out in academia. I earned a PhD in American intellectual history and thought I would become a historian, an academic. But while I was a grad student, I moved to Washington, D.C. to do some research, and I fell in with the think tank crowd, which turned out,
a mistake.
I know, right? So much trouble, those folks. But as it happened, I started doing some sort of policy work on the side, little freelance writing here and there, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed being able to combine my love of research and the archives and history with contemporary politics, contemporary policy making. So when I finished my PhD, I started working in the think tank world. That included a stint at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where with a group of friends, we started a journal about technology and society called The New Atlantis, which is still going strong 25 years later. And then I spent some time at a left of center think tank called the New America Foundation. And then at Commentary magazine for a while. I also was managing editor of the Weekly Standard for a while. And then I came home to the American Enterprise Institute. And it's home because I had been an adjunct fellow there for many, many years and done work with some economists there and other folks there. And then a lot of my oldest friends in Washington had ended up there as well. So I am in a project there called Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies. And we are sort of an island of misfit toys. We've got lawyers, we have political scientists. I'm a historian. We have cultural historians. We have classicists. And we're all a kind of interesting small group that shares each other's work across the table. We debate. Not everything we do has an immediate policy implication, but much of what we do supplies grounding, history, cultural context for some of the most important political, social, cultural issues coming down the pipeline. So I'm very, very happy to be there. And then also write for Commentary every month and other places, and keep one toe in academia through an appointment at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. So I still like to dabble in academia when I can. That's
great. You're a case study for being a generalist,
yes,
which I like because I'm all over the place too. So I like when people are not so specialized because I don't feel so lonely.
Yes.
But so let's talk about your article. It's called The Elite War on the American Middle Class and How to End It. So can you summarize the central theme of your article and what prompted you to write it at this particular moment?
Well, I come from the middle class. So that one thing that struck me in recent years, both politically, but especially culturally, is that we hear a lot about the poorer classes. We hear a lot about the elite. Those two groups get a lot of attention in popular culture, in politics, in social policy making. What we don't hear from is what most people in this country are, which is the vast middle. Now, there are lots of different ways to define the middle, but in general, the middle class has been this sort of ideal in American society, right? Stabilizing force. People who are patriotic, believe in meritocracy, want their kids to do better than they did, work hard, care about family and civic life. These ideals were largely reflected in popular culture. Most, sitcoms and television shows and radio shows from basically throughout the 20th century focused very positively on the American middle class. And I noticed in recent years that had sort of disappeared. And there was a lot of cultural contempt for the middle class that was being expressed in television and movies and punditry. And it struck me that that was probably bad for the country. And that's because most people are somewhere in the vast middle, politically, culturally, socially, economically. But if the people who are setting the tone and tenor of our conversations and running our institutions are from either the super elite or the very bottom activist class who kind of want social justice and revolution and upheaval, then the voice of the middle is not getting heard.
So is the middle class in your mind, when we hear talking about the silent majority, mm-hmm. do you think that's the middle class?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was talking about this piece with my editor, John Podhoretz, I said we should call it the simmering majority, because if you look at some of the expressions of the middle class now, they're annoyed. And I think they have a right to be. They do feel like the people in this country who try to play by the rules, who try to earn a living, who are trying to keep up and do the best they can. And they look all around them and they see others breaking the rules. They see disorder and institutional and cultural breakdown. And instead of hearing solutions from the people in charge and the leaders of cultural and political institutions, they hear scolding directed largely at them and their views and their ideas.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because when I read that article, it really moved something in me that I had never thought about in the 25 years where I was here. I realized that when I say in English, the middle class, it evokes something for me. Mm. And if I say it in French, it doesn't evoke the same thing.
Oh, that's interesting.
And in a way, there's something very American about the middle class. And you talk about it that in a way, right? There's just kind of the middle class is this kind of, we have this notion here of this kind of bourgeois country in the sense that everyone calls themselves the middle class. It's part of our nature as a commercial people. And it's very different. It is different. It's very different. It's something so much more than, and when I think about it in French, where in French is really kind of something descriptive of kind of an income mm-hmm. class, mm-hmm. right? And so, and you talk about how the middle class evokes an idea and an ideal, right?
Yes.
And that is really, really different. And this is kind of like why I wanted to talk to you, because it just never occurred to me. That's the first thing. It just really never occurred to me that there was this just ingrained difference for me. Mm-hmm. That word alone carried a feeling that it didn't carry when I was in French. So I wanted to also ask you, there's a sense, for me at least, that what it means to be middle class in the 1950s, for better or worse, really still shapes the way we think about the middle class. So is it the case that there's some nostalgia attached to our feelings about the middle class?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is actually one of the challenges of thinking about what it means today versus what it meant in a previous century. Because, I mean, as a woman, I wouldn't want to go back to the 1950s. I don't want to be in that scenario at all. So so I don't have that nostalgia. At the same time, I certainly think it was reflected for decades, long past the point at which that particular social order and cultural order had broken down. Popular culture still reflected it rather strongly. What's changed now is that there are still the values that were embraced there when it was, the stay-at-home mom and the kids and you could earn a living with one income. That doesn't exist anymore for most people. That's not the reality. Most families need two incomes, and the sort of 1950s perfect Leave It to Beaver nuclear family is not the norm among the middle now, and that's fine. But some things have stayed the same. One thing that struck me when I was looking at other cultural markers of middle class. Being in the middle class is that our army and all volunteer military comes from the middle class, the vast majority of our soldiers. And that struck me. I was like, that's another area where the elite don't send their sons and daughters off to war. And the poor send some, but not as many as the vast middle. And so when we think about ideas like patriotism, meritocracy, our military remains one of the most highly meritocratic institutions on earth. And it has been for many, many generations. The values of those sorts of institutions, which shape a lot of sons and daughters of the middle class, aren't shared by the elite policymakers who are often, passing laws that affect those people. So there's this disconnect. There's also a real suspicion of patriotism among, I would say, wealthy, well-educated elites and their children who tend to go to, Ivy plus colleges and have a kind of sense of the United States as a vast historical problem rather than a beacon of freedom and opportunity.
Yeah, the thing you mentioned with the Army, I thought it was really interesting. So do you think that moving away, like making it a volunteer army, did it change anything? Or was it that before, when we had a draft, basically it was an opportunity to, I'm not for the draft, by the way, but it was an opportunity to actually kind of have a shared lived experience or something.
Yes. I mean, what was interesting about the military when there was a draft is that many wealthy families were able to get deferments for their children by pulling strings.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was a shared experience. And in a country like ours, which is back to having an all volunteer military, we don't have mandatory service like they do in other countries. We don't have those kind of transitional institutions between, say, like high school and college, or high school and trade school, or high school and adult life, where everybody kind of participates in a singular civic activity. We vote together. That's the one thing we can all do together. And that leads to some fragmentation, I think. The other concern is that all the places that we used to, where classes would come together, we have fewer and fewer of those now. First of all, a lot of the sort of civic engagement happens online, which isn't the same as in person. Mm-hmm. People are no longer doing things like attending church in as high a numbers as they used to. That used to be a place where class barriers were dissolved, at least for a little while in many places. And just a lot of those third places, the kinds of clubs and gathering places where people of different classes could ideally come together and intermingle in a way that used to be common, but is becoming less so. Those were, again, all ways for people to try to help understand and empathize with people who weren't like them. We have less and less of that, particularly, again, in our elite making institutions, where the vast majority of the people on those campuses are all from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Regardless of their race or their sex, they tend to all be from a similar socioeconomic background.
So you write that the member of the middle class believed, and the country believed, that they were the nation's backbone, its true governing class, and its moral compass. But obviously, this feeling or this belief is changing.
Yes.
Right. So what's happening?
Well, I think what we see now, if you look at examples in popular culture, and particularly our governing class, people who come out of the Ivy plus universities and whatnot, who go on to control media and cultural and political institutions, you have elite values. And we now have interesting data about this, how they have very different views about things. For example, they tend to trust government more than the average person does. They tend to. That was
the Rasmussen.
Yes, the Rasmussen poll. It's really fascinating. I mean, they tend to think that it's fine to place limitations on freedom. For example, telling people they shouldn't drive certain kinds of cars or fly in airplanes because of the concerns about the climate. They shouldn't eat meat. And they're very trusting of the institutions of power imposing such restrictions, in part, I think, because they run them. So if you're someone who doesn't run things and you're looking at this, you're going, wait a minute, who are you to tell me how much meat I can eat every week, or to tell me what kind of car I'm going to drive? So there's a real value bifurcation. And these might seem like small things, but when you add them all up, it's a different worldview. And the other part of that, I think, for people who come out of elite making institutions is often, first of all, many of them have had an economic cushion their whole lives. They don't really know what it means to live paycheck to paycheck. So then they run an institution that imposes things on people. And their biggest concern is, for example, that their middle class and working class employees are racist. So they devise these bureaucratic systems to retrain people in these wrong-headed ideas, because they know, as wealthy, well-educated elites, what's best and what's right and what's progressive. And you see a lot of this tension and all the so-called woke arguments and all this stuff. That's a reflection of class as much as it is anything else ideologically, because you have a whole group of people who actually live, the vast middle with intermarriage rates in particular, live in a very multiracial, multi-ethnic way, far more so, I might add, than many of the elites who are telling them they are racist. So there are some strange ironies and a lot of room for conflict there, especially because so much of the policymaking and the directives are being handed from the top down.
you said the word class, and obviously we've said it each time we say the middle class, but I think it's kind of interesting because this prevalence of the feeling that the middle class was the backbone of America, effectively what it seems to have done is to actually take away a big component of class warfare that we see in a lot of other countries.
Yes.
But that seems to be changing in a sense because the country is more polarized. And that means basically they're just really two poles going at each other. And I just kind of, do you think there's a risk that we're becoming culturally more like other countries, that basically we've escaped for so long kind of this faith that other countries have had? Does this make any sense?
Yes, and it's a real concern because I think the leavening influence of the middle has served an important function for social and cultural stability for a long time. And what's changed now? So you've always had politicians engaging in class warfare for their own political gain, right? You know, you've got Bernie Sanders, himself a millionaire, railing against and writing books about millionaires. And you've got people on, you know, who champion the causes of the poor and who also want to say anyone who earns a certain amount of money is, you know, corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. That's always gone on in this country. But what the middle did is embrace a set of very optimistic values, which were grounded in the idea that if you work hard and you play by the rules and you do what's right, you can try to make a better life for your kids. Like the next generation will improve on that. And that has happened until recently. And that optimism is really important just in terms of how we express ourselves culturally and socially. And that is what is declining now. When you look at some of the survey and opinion research that's being done, middle-class people will say, I'm not sure there is such a thing as the American dream anymore. It's just not, I can barely make ends meet, even though I'm, you know, working twice as hard. I'm staying right in the same place, and I worry about my children's future. That number is increasing. There have always been people who worry in that sense, but the optimism is the part that concerns me, because that's how in the next generation we inculcate the kinds of values like, look, here's how our system works. If you work hard and you seize every opportunity, you can get ahead. And I don't think, especially among our younger generations, I don't think they believe that anymore. And that creates a kind of cynicism that in conjunction with the political polarization you were describing is a dangerous combination. So I do worry about that, how people express hopes for the future, because those numbers are not healthy right now.
So I want to try to unpack why people are feeling this way, because, you know, as an economist, I can't help to say that, yes, that, you know, income is changing for the middle class in a positive way.
Yes, many people
actually it's more people are moving up to upper class. I mean, and it's like the middle class is income is going up. I mean, by you know, they're doing great, and yet they just are feeling that they can't make it, that there's something is just not working for them. They're just and I just don't want to say like people don't realize that really they're better off than they were 20 years ago, or they can't realize that actually their purchasing power or what they can buy with their money, you know, it's so much more high quality and better. And, you know, that just doesn't get us very far. So I just want to try to kind of understand, what are the various issues for that middle class, right? What is it that they face? What are the cultural, the essential cultural problem? I mean, you mentioned some, like you talked about their place in the world, their literally physical place in the world. So can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Right. Well, one thing culturally is that I think the middle class no longer sees any reflection of itself in popular culture. And if they do see a reflection of themselves, it's often negative, right? It's mocking. It's not, you see a lot of elite culture and you see a lot of, you know, sort of lower class culture. You do not see that middle anymore. And so there's one frustration. So even if your purchasing power is going far, if every movie and every television show you turn on is either scolding you or showing you a lifestyle you'll never be able to afford because only 0.001% of people on earth can afford it, that'll skew your reality. The other thing I'll say is that I think there were for a lot of middle-class people, the value of local neighborhoods, feeling like, your local place was a place of order and where you could contribute. That's changed. I think I've talked to a lot of people who will say, look, I play by the rules and everybody breaking the rules gets away with it. So one thing that struck me during COVID were I'm a public school parent. My kids' schools were shut down for a year because of very active teachers union in the District of Columbia. They refused to come back to work even after being vaccinated. A lot of parents organized over this across the country, not just in my city. But what you found were a lot of people who could afford to just going back, the private schools reopened and the kids didn't have to wear masks all the time. Private or wealthier parents were able to form little groups and pay tutors. So their kids continued to be educated. The
people literally moved.
Yes, people could move if they had the means. They could move. The vast middle can't do that. We're all stuck playing by the rules. So this was where I think people started to say, well, wait a minute. Then they looked at, the political leaders, Nancy Pelosi's, the Gavin Newsoms, who were doing all their own they're going out to fancy dinners with their friends without masks. They're going getting their hair done at the beauty salon. The rest of us weren't allowed to do that. So there was a kind of aha moment where people said, well, wait a minute, you all make these rules, but you don't follow them. We are punished if we don't follow them.
And then also, there was the fact that really, I think it's Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford who called it the computer class. During the lockdown, right? Like all of us whose work really mostly takes place on a computer, we were fine.
Right. We could stay at home and work.
We were absolutely fine. And we were working and we were actually but if you were, if you were low income or low skills, you were still working. You were still the one going out there when everyone was afraid because we didn't know really what was going on. You were the one keeping the grocery stores open. And for the middle class, I assume like the bank teller and those type of profession, they were at home wondering what was going to happen to their jobs.
Many of them lost their jobs
and loved their jobs. And that was a decision that was made by the elites who didn't really bear much of the consequences of these decisions. So I assume it was a big trigger, but it started before, right?
Right. And there's also sort of issues around pick any big hot button issue. And there is a kind of middle class perspective, or you can even call it common sense perspective now. Law and order, for example, like shoplifting. Shoplifters should be prosecuted. They're breaking the law. Now, you can have differences of opinion about how strictly you should punish them, if it's a juvenile versus an adult, a recidivist or not, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, if you steal, you should face a punishment. Well, what I think a lot of people see around them now, they see this with local crime. They see this with what's going on our southern border. They're like, wait a minute, we have laws. People are clearly breaking the law. Nothing happens when they break the law. The law doesn't seem to apply because then, and this is where the sort of elite values are used to lecture the middle. When the middle class says, well, hey, that shouldn't be allowed. That's illegal. They're called racist. They are told that they should understand systems of oppression and that root causes of crime are far more important than punishing criminals. And none of this tracks with their experience. And their experience, by the way, as you said earlier about with COVID, like they're the ones living near the neighborhoods where there is higher crime. They're not living in gated communities, safe and far away from the crime that everyone's saying we shouldn't really punish. So they see this. It's a very discombobulating thing to be told that your concern about law and order makes you racist or oppressive, when what you're seeing is a breakdown of order that affects you and that creates fear and uncertainty.
And the other things that you mentioned in your article, which I thought is really interesting, there are two things. It's like, it's not just that they're not seeing themselves reflected in kind of the discourse of the cultural discourse, but it's also that politicians don't talk about the middle class as much. And to the extent that there are TV shows that are reflecting the middle class and that the media is ignoring them.
Yes.
And I thought it was so interesting because you mentioned young Sheldon, for instance. And I would not know about young Sheldon if it weren't for Facebook sending me clips of it, which I find very cute and funny. And then you, like this article that you cite, talks about how this Big Bang universe effectively, is actually one of the most viewed thing, and it's been going on for a long time. And the elite media, the media the cultural media talking about TV, can't say I follow it super, super closely, but they're not talking about it.
Right. Well, that stems in part from the, a lot of this comes out of the way we've changed our educational pipeline. And so the Ivy Plus ultra elite universities do funnel a lot of people to elite media institutions. If you look at the staffing numbers of the editors and the writers at places like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they all come out of this same handful of schools. So those schools are creating a worldview for their graduates that has a very particular perspective, and it is not one that understands the middle class. Now, some of those people might actually have started out in the middle class, and they're expecting to rise by going through these universities. But that too is becoming an even greater challenge for, if you're a middle class parent and you want your kids to go to an Ivy League university or even an Ivy Plus, the best possible school, and your kid's smart, good grades, good, does everything right, maybe a public school student from a good school, with that exact same resume, a kid who is wealthy from the upper middle class or upper classes has twice as much of a chance of getting into that school as your kid, and for no other reason than the parents' wealth. That struck me. That's also a new thing that did not used to be the case. Those places used to have much more class mixing. And while they have expanded the pool of candidates from the lower classes and the poorer folks, which is a good thing, I think, they've done it at the expense of the middle, and they have vastly increased the number of wealthy kids. And so again, these institutions are formative. They funnel people into leadership positions in other institutions.
Well, in fact, I think education is a better indicator or predictor of income. So
yes.
Before we dive more into education and the problem with education and how, in a way, it's really kind of the middle class may feel, bombed about that. I just want to go back to this, to politicians. Politicians used to talk about the middle class a lot. In fact, to be honest, for me, it used to kind of annoy me. It was just like, it's always the middle class, and being French, maybe like I just didn't feel like I belonged that much to the middle class. But I used to notice it. And when I read your article, I was like, wow, it's true. Actually, they don't talk about the middle class anymore.
Right. They talk about, so if you look at the last couple of elections, a lot of discussion about working class voters and a lot of elite discussion, intra-elite discussion, political discussion, not much about the middle. Obama really was the last president who kind of hammered that theme. And he only did it because he had smart political advisors who made him do it. It wasn't his instinct either. He actually is a member of that elite that probably doesn't think much about the middle. But that used to be who politicians pandered to. You're right to be like, oh, this is so weird. It's total pandering. But that's also where most of the votes are.
Well, that's politics.
Yes, that's where the votes are. Why aren't they? This is the vast majority of voters.
Well, so let me ask you this, because I am not, politics, I make a point of not really knowing very much about it. But isn't it the case that the middle class is still the biggest voter class?
It is.
So, isn't there a risk for politicians to ignore the middle class, or is there no consequences? Because if you're the middle class, you believe in voting because you believe that this is, this is something you should do. And hence, even if they ignore you, you're going to go to the polls.
Well, one of the challenges now is that both parties in their own different, distinct ways cater to their fringes. And this is where the political polarization has made it difficult for the middle class to have their voice heard. So I think part of the reason we're barreling towards an election where nobody wants either of the candidates who are at the top of both tickets is that, the fringes, politicians look to the fringe, and especially in a world where social media really drives a lot of the political conversation, unfortunately, you have the loudest voices in the room doing the most moral grandstanding get most of the attention. And that is not the middle class way. The middle class is like, we want to be able to send our kids to college without a lot of debt, be able to afford our bills, take a nice vacation now and then, have a stable, live in a crime-free neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. That is not something the politicians talk about. They talk about giving money away or taking it or stopping the wealthy from accruing more wealth or giving poor people who need more help more money. And those are two poles. And in the vast middle, again, so look, you think about paying for things. I mean, I interviewed a couple students who came from middle-class families, got into elite universities, and they're still paying off. They're starting to pay off student loans. They're sort of horrified by the student loan, transfer. I refuse to call it debt forgiveness because it's not. That money is going to be paid. It's a transfer of debt to people who didn't go to those colleges. That's a perfect example of an elite idea of something that sounds good, but actually is helping fellow elite members. Because most of the people who are getting that debt transferred away from them are already members of the elite. They're higher income people already. Of course, they've gotten advanced degrees, right? They've gone through that process. How is that fair to people who didn't go to college? How is that fair to people who might have gotten a bachelor's or an associate's degree and now are mid-level managers in some corporation? That's the middle class. They're not getting anything from that. Again, they look at that and say, wait a minute, how is that helping the vast number of people like me? It's not.
Yeah. So the student loan transfer, it seems to me that this is an elite redistribution towards the elites,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because I mean, like especially like the one that was knocked down by, I don't know a ton about the second one, the debt forgiveness that he's been doing right now. But the first one was clearly really an elite to elite handout. It was just
and the parties are realigning on class lines too. The Democratic Party is now the party of wealthy, highly educated elites. It didn't used to be. It is now.
But still pander to
the working class voter and lower income voters. Yes.
Yeah, so everyone panders to the working class because in the populist, right,
on
the new
right, exactly.
So it's like, so
the middle is sitting there going, anyone,
and in fact, you cite Rob Henderson, Luxury Belief piece, a book, Troubled, and I thought, it's very often we think about it in the context of left-wing elites that impose their views at high cost. I mean, they're signaling that they're virtuous by imposing their beliefs, which end up backfiring and hurting lower income or middle class people. But there's also a right wing version of this, right? They're newly embraced of hardcore protectionism, and I mean, it's backfiring also because consumers are the hardest hit by like heavy tariffs and things like this. So anyway, so it's just like it's across the board, the luxury beliefs culture. But let's talk about education, because you make the case that the middle class, feels also the burden of the change in our culture and for K-12 and higher ed. You've talked a little bit about higher ed, but K-12 is also a place.
Yes. This is another arena. And again, pre-COVID, this was already starting up, but I think what happened during the pandemic is that it both accelerated this trend and made it much more visible to people who might not have been aware of it. And that's the obliteration of meritocratic standards in K through 12. The elimination of honors courses because they were considered racist or somehow oppressive. The elimination of any sort of standardized testing. The idea that these tests were somehow unfairly advantaging the wrong sorts of people and disadvantaging others, even though, although not perfect, these were the one thing that couldn't be gamed with the kind of manipulations that actually help the wealthy students the most, because they can pad their resumes and do extracurriculars and all this other stuff, versus a middle class or a working class kid who has to go have a job after school, for example, or who can't afford, dressage lessons or whatever it is people take. So the elimination of those standards meant that it was cutting off a lot of middle class kids from a pipeline that would give them an opportunity to get into some of these elite schools after they graduated from high school. And they weren't exposed to as many honors courses as if a progressive school board decided that honors courses weren't fair. So all of these things angered parents, because middle class parent who has a smart kid who should be in an honors math class is like, why is there no more honors math class? Why is my kid sitting here languishing in beginning algebra because other kids can't keep up? That's not fair. And that parent's correct. That's not fair. So we used to have more opportunities based on merit that have been slowly eliminated for ideological reasons, not for any sort of rational assessment of the outcomes. Because we do know that is one thing that will tell you whether a kid has a likelihood of being successful in college is what their SAT or ACT score is. That is still a very high predictor of future success in higher education. So eliminating those and eliminating entrance exams for, application only public high schools, for example, like Bronx Science and other places that have for decades lifted kids from lower classes and middle classes and vaunted them into the higher reaches of learning, particularly in math and science. Those opportunities are being chipped away at for ideological reasons.
And colleges are bringing SAT
yes,
back,
they are.
Which is a great thing. Of course, I'm annoyed because both my children applied to college while the ACTs were.
It was the optional year. Yeah.
It's okay. both of them. Yeah, both of them, and it was just kind of crazy. Yeah. I mean, It's just like the amount, because what it ended up doing is just exploding the number of applicants at a lot of schools, really, and it was just kind of. Yeah. Anyway, but I mean, it was just, and the reason why, this is important, that there's a pathway for middle class kids to universities that are important and kind of another, like a highway towards elite groups. It's because in the end, the elite groups are going to be the people setting the rules and deciding of the politics. So it'd be better if that group was made of varied people with different backgrounds.
Exactly. And we are eliminating those pipelines constantly, especially in higher education.
Let me ask you about the cost of things that have traditionally been affordable to the middle class and are going up and feeling, you mentioned it, like getting out of their reach, like higher education and housing. The upper middle class can still pay for those, but the middle class is finding it harder. I mean, these are areas where the government is really often involved in housing in particular, right? It's like, it's supply side constraints. And then that supply side constraint is faced with political obstacles by the elites who have homes, who don't want to lift the zoning rules. How do you think that contributes to their unhappiness?
What's interesting about that is that now we're starting to talk about exactly as you described the problem. And that is the problem, because you do have a lot of very wealthy people living in neighborhoods where they want low density and they're paying for the low density because they can afford it. And yet they will tell you things, I've talked to many of these people. They'll say, oh, well, we're going to build affordable housing over there by the train tracks. And when you point out, well, there's this meadow, you could put a ton of units there, and all these people who work for you instead of having to drive 3 hours to come clean your house or to manage your stuff would be able to, take a quick train ride. Oh, no. No. I mean, so there is a weird cognitive dissonance that goes on, particularly among the wealthiest elite, many of whom at this point are now, I would say, more Democratic Party aligned than Republican. These are not country club Republican types. These are like people with second and third homes, and they can afford to live in many different places. They have a lot of money, a lot of resources. What they don't want is anything to spoil their view. These are the same people who want solar wind farms as long as it doesn't spoil their waterfront view. It's a lot of hypocrisy.
I live in Arlington County, and I can tell you, I know a lot of people only have one homes, but they don't
want the density.
They don't want the density. They don't want
traffic.
They don't want the traffic. And what are we going to do with schools? And also it's kind of like there is a suspicion of something that's not a single family home and all of this, right? It's like, I think this is unfortunately, it's a trait that works not just for people with 2 or 3 homes. But the thing that's also interesting, so the Federal Reserve has a tool that is interesting because it breaks down wealth composition by wealth group. And I went and looked before this interview. I went to actually look at it. And what you see is really the middle class wealth has gone up quite significantly, and there are more upper class people, and we can have debate about how fast each group has grown and all this. But what's really interesting about the middle class is like a lot of the wealth they have, and to some extent is the upper middle class is true too. A lot of the health they have is tied up
in their homes,
in these assets.
Yes.
Right. So in a way, they're better, but it's all tied up.
And they can't, they can take out a second or third mortgage to help fund their kids' education, for example, but they can't move and say, like, because everything's gone up, right? I mean, interest rates have gone up. So if you move and you got to get a new mortgage, you're paying more, and maybe you're getting less house than what if you just stayed where you are. No, I mean, it's a challenge for people. It's absolutely true.
And of course, it's a vicious cycle because those people who are in the upper middle class and a really upper class, as we've said, they tend to favor more government intervention.
Yes.
And then they just see no problem with actually the government regulating, how everyone, like what people can do with their assets, with their property. So you may have actually a lot of your assets tied up in a single family home. And if you decided you wanted to rent the basement, well, you may not be able to because of those zoning rules. And it's just this really vicious cycle. Mm-hmm. What do you think also about the fact that they may have a feeling that the lower class get a lot of the welfare benefits, but and that they won't get, and meanwhile the upper classes, they have access to all the lawyers who can actually kind of help them get away with a lot of. Is there some truth to this? And at least do people think that this is one of the ways the middle class is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way in which the social compact, when it functioned well, you had a very wealthy class that was also very philanthropic, gave a lot of its money away. Carnegie built libraries. We had this sort of ethos of we're gonna give a lot of this money away and do good. You had a middle class that was always a little nervous about how much am I going to be taxed to fund people who don't work or refuse to work? And we out of that came we got welfare reform. We've gotten all kinds of policy shifts. Right now, though, the sense I get is that there's a lot of people who feel like all of the political leadership is focused on making sure that elite stays elite and protected, and nobody gets too close to the money that they have, and also that any money that is spent by the government goes to the lower classes. It goes to people. During COVID, a lot of people were paid not to work, and a lot of people liked that feeling, and a lot of those benefits, I would argue, went on way too long because it's not just about how we have a social safety net and support
I argue
people.
That too, by the way.
I didn't know that, but I'm glad we agree.
It was way too big, too big to begin with, way bigger. I'm not going to bore you with the size of the output gap, but it was way too big and it went on way too long.
Well, and that in turn, this is where culture and economics merge, right? You pay people not to work, they get in the habit of not working. And then when it's time to work again and the job's like, wait, I got to do that job for this amount of money. I could just sit at home and do nothing except what I want and still get a check from the government. So I think the middle class, the values of the middle class were supposed to say, no, you're supposed to work. You're supposed to actually be a member of society who contributes. But when you start to feel like your tax dollars are being spent, for example, in your public school district to indoctrinating your kids about things that you don't agree with, and then if you show up at the school board meeting and protest, you're called, a terrorist or much worse. Again, that's a social compact breakdown. It's like, wait a minute. We're supposed to be able to have a voice. We understand that some of our taxes will go to help others who are less fortunate. But what are our political leaders doing with this money, really? And there's a huge amount of, we have decline of trust in a lot of institutions, but in government, most of all. I mean, people really don't trust that the elected officials they send to Washington have their best interests at heart, unless they are on either fringe, very engaged and polarized already. And then, as we've seen, you just see the fringes fighting each other, and there's the horseshoe theory keeps coming true in our politics lately. So
it's really interesting because before I read your article, I really kind of didn't realize this cultural importance of the middle class. I mean, I was just like suffer my economic bias. So let's talk about what you suggest we do to end this. And is the goal, that's something I wanted to ask you. What you wish we could do is to restore a vibrant middle class. How do you define that? Is it in terms of number, right? Is it a group that's in the middle of the income distribution, even though that income distribution is much higher than it used to be for past generation, right? But that's kind of one where people can look around, and everywhere they look, they see people like them.
Yes.
Not everywhere, but a lot of it they see. Is that what you're hope we'll go back to.
Yes, I mean there are economic definitions of class that we know, and but one of the reasons I didn't go into detail saying this exactly is what I mean by middle class is that look, if you live in a city like I do, I live in Washington D.C. What it takes to be a middle class family here is very different than what it takes in Oklahoma City, for example. Yeah. So you can do the calculations and whatnot. But
by the way, I was surprised. I went to look at what was the income level for middle class and was surprised about how big. So the Pew Research Center says the middle class income between 2/3 and twice the national median income. So that's basically, I'm going to round it up, between $68,000 to $203,000.
Right.
That's a lot.
It's a wide range.
That said, the American people, when they think about the middle class in terms of income, they think about $75,000, so roughly the median income, and $100,000.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting.
Well, and to your earlier point, it's true that so in the 70s, about 60% of the country could have been considered middle class. Now, 2021, the figures, actually, these were Pew figures too.
50%.
Yeah, 50%. But that's because so the lower income grew by 4% from 25 in 1970 to 29%. But the upper income grew too, from 14 to 21%. And those were people
much more.
Yes, exactly.
Grew much more. So to the extent that using this type of measure, people are saying the middle class is shrinking. It's shrinking because people are moving up.
Yes, and they are moving up, and some are probably also moving down. But we have a lot of class mobility in this country still, which is a good thing. What concerns me again is culturally and politically, we are not talking to the vast middle. We are screaming at the extremes, and our political leadership reflects that. And in our formative institutions, particularly in higher education, we are rewarding wealth, not merit. We are rewarding wealth, not merit, and we're not rewarding identity. Like I know, especially on the right side of the aisle, there's been a lot of focus on identity politics and a lot of that. I mean, I look at some of that stuff myself. But the thing that concerns me is that actually socioeconomic change in higher education is having a much more deleterious effect on the kind of leaders we're producing, both culturally and politically, I would argue. And that's where we can do something to change it. We can, as we were talking earlier, reinstate standardized testing so that kids have merit as something that can get them in there. I argue that we need to seriously reconsider the number of foreign students that are allowed on campuses. These colleges operate, many of them, the elite ones, operate like hedge funds. So they need a lot of money. They need kids who will pay full freight. They need wealthy families who will give large donation checks every year to keep that endowment going. And a lot of the number of foreign students who come to the U.S. now as full freight students, often paid for by their countries of origin, has increased dramatically. Those spots, it is a pie. There are only a certain number of pieces. Those spots are taken away from someone. And what we can see from the numbers is largely it's from the middle, because the middle is usually paying some tuition, but has some loans and other scholarship help as well. So that's something we could think about doing, like making sure that there's enough kids from the middle who have that opportunity. And then our politicians need to start talking to the average person again. I mean,
and also you want to get rid of legacy.
Yes, I absolutely want to eliminate legacy preferences. There is no argument you can make that doesn't have legacy preferences are about giving preference to wealthy kids. And there is nothing you can tell me that says otherwise. And we know this, and we know that it really merit will not suffer. MIT does not use legacy preference, and they have a much more socioeconomically diverse student body, lots of talented kids.
So, I mean, I'm with you. I would get rid of legacy and everything. And I don't have that much of a beef with the forest students, but I would be much more radical than you. I would actually
let's hear it.
I would cut all subsidies to higher ed. Government subsidies to higher ed, because the system you describe, the reforms you describe, does not fix the problem of the high cost of these places.
That's right. The tuition rises.
You can make that, like Yale just announced, they're raising their tuition. So it's going to be $90,000 a year. Now, I know that at Yale, I think if the parents make less, the family makes less than 65,000, I think you go for free. But I don't think they're taking that many kids.
There's not that many kids.
So you can get rid of legacy, get rid of the foreign students, and you're still faced with an enormous price tag for these schools.
Yes.
the thing that will change the system fundamentally is if you get rid of all the higher ed subsidies from the government. And I am big proponent of, I think Brian Kaplan makes a very strong case for this. I think this is where you got to go, because you can make space, but this is not your middle class kids that are going to go with SATs or not, because they can't afford it. Now, I would tell you, usually when people talk about, oh, we can't get into college, my rebuttal is always, well, actually, we can't go into college because we think that the only way to go to college is the first 25 of those schools. And the reality is America is blessed with enormous higher ed institution. That said, in the context of our conversation, you're entirely correct, because where you go to school is then feeding into the elites and is much more important predictor of this. So in that sense, this is why I think your measures don't cut it, Christine.
I gotta be more radical. I love this.
You have to be much, much more radical.
I'm going to be radicalized by the end of this podcast. I will.
Yeah, exactly. And I can, and you and I could form a group of two. I mean, Brian Kaplan will join us, I'm sure. But so I want to hear you about your politicians talking to people.
Well, this is one of the things that really struck me, because going back and thinking about, the most recent elections we've had, the populist wave, concerns about the working class. In the upcoming election, there's a lot of concern on the Democratic side about non-white working class voters migrating away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party. There's concern among the Republicans about, college-educated women moving more towards the Democratic Party. So there's all kinds of shifts going on right now. All of these historically, it's time actually for big party realignment. If you ask me, we've had these two kind of, structures for a while. So that's all to the good, I suppose, unless you're a candidate. But what I don't hear, even from people running statewide elections, and this is in part due to the fact that now all issues become nationalized immediately if someone puts something on X or Facebook. So if you think about how our politicians are thinking of their jobs, we now have a lot of politicians who see themselves as performers in a global social media fueled ecosphere. I'm thinking here of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She doesn't have constituents; she has followers, and there are far too many politicians who measure that sort of visibility, which means the mundane issues of their local constituents, many of whom are middle class and who put them in office to make sure that the place they come from stays, healthy, safe, vibrant economically, all these things. That doesn't matter as much to them, and they don't get much attention for that. And so I worry that our political class needs to have a kind of come to Jesus moment where they realize that the vast majority of people don't want to fight culture wars. They don't have accounts on X. They are not engaged in this kind of, constant online scream fest. They just want to have a good, happy, comfortable life, and they want their kids to do better than they are. And they want their kids to have opportunities. A politician that says that is going to get a lot more interest. Now, this means, of course, dealing with our political primary system right now, which is skewed to reward. That's where I become radical. Because the party system is a mess, and the primary system rewards the most extreme, which is not actually what the average general election voter wants. So there's a lot of issues.
It seems to be like we have the political system right now rewards confrontation.
Yes, exactly.
As opposed to finding solutions or even talking to vote. It's like confrontation seems to be the point. The other thing is you kind of feel especially with the new right, that kind of losing is also maybe even the point,
Martyrdom.
or that they don't want to be in power, or that kind of losing gives them more power, cultural power.
Power is once you have power, you actually have to do something with it. So it's much easier to rant and rave.
Yeah, exactly. It's really, really difficult. When you end the piece, you said there are no partisan proposal. These are not partisan proposal. Rather, I'm talking about modest step towards a politics and culture that might once again enjoy greater stability, prosperity, and common sense wisdom. Embracing middle class politics is neither exciting nor revolutionary. I can't say that word, and then but at a time of simmering resentment and instability, it may be just a prescription to save the country for its sometimes seemingly incurable ailment. And I hope we get your way,
With a dash of your revolution, I have to say.
Yes. But I think what we need to do is as much as I adore having to be able to watch whatever it is I want, at whatever time I want, there was something to be said about when we were all watching TV together. Right? I mean, and I don't want to go backwards, but it is true that it's all about trade-offs, and we're just starting to kind of find that they're just, it is really shaking the country in a way that was not, predictable.
Mm-hmm.
But I hope you get your way. So let me ask you one last question. What is the most mistaken claim that you think needs to be corrected on this topic?
About the middle class?
Yes.
That they are people who are racist, backward-looking, sexist, all the sort of isms that if you are a member of the elite and been educated in elite institutions, you are taught to assume about everyone beneath you on the socioeconomic scale is not true. I would argue, and I think all of us who come from the middle class can attest to this. They, if you grow up in a culture that is multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious, I mean, there's so much diversity. They live the diversity. They don't preach it. So to be preached at from an elite that actually lives a much less diverse lifestyle, but preaches something else to everybody else, that is not sustainable. And that, I think, is a moment where the elites need to do a little reflection about their own values and their own misguided assumptions about everyone beneath them on the socioeconomic scale.
Well, thank you very much. We'll touch base maybe next year to see, how much progress we've made after
Fingers
the
crossed.
election. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you.